CBP started the day with over 12,000 migrants in our custody. As of this morning, that number was 13,400.
In October 2018, a few hundred desperate migrants left the Honduran city of San Pedro Sula and headed north. As they wound their way through Guatemala and Mexico, their numbers swelled to more than 7,000. Like others before it, the caravan drew ire from American politicians.
Immigration is a really dangerous topic, and we're not going to allow people to come into our country that don't have the well-being of our country in mind.
It also focused public attention on 3 Central American countries: Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the Northern Triangle, whose fractured societies are at the heart of the Western Hemisphere's growing humanitarian emergency. The Northern Triangle, the origins of America's migrant crisis. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
In Central America's 3 most populous countries, law and order are breaking down. El Salvador and Honduras have the world's highest murder rates. Guatemala is close behind.
It's difficult to talk about the issues without looking at the living conditions for most people in Central America on a daily basis.
They have a very young population in those countries that is coming to working age each year that doesn't have jobs. You have climate chaos, agricultural failure, which is resulting in farmers leaving their land. Because of that nutritional shortfall, you have widespread stunting. Children in Guatemala, age 9 or 6 inches shorter than the same related children raised in the United States. Throw that in with the corruption at the top. You have that, then you have the role of the drug cartels, then you have the street gangs, and you have the domestic violence, and you have the inadequate number of jobs.
Large numbers of people, anything between 800,000 and 1.3, 1.4 million a year, are fleeing from endemic danger as a result of gang violence, enormous levels of poverty, quite high degrees of persecution when it comes to, for example, lesbian and gay populations.
Fundamentally, the problem is one of geography. The narrow landmass of Central America is a choke point between the coca fields of the Andes and the world's largest market for cocaine, the United States.
It's really short-sighted to just look at it as cocaine. Each of those bales is really the embodiment of violence, corruption, and instability in a region, Central America, that just can't absorb it. So when we see those problems arise on our southwest border, cocaine is the genesis of those problems.
Central America and Honduras, that's right in the middle of Central America. It serves like a bridge. It's a central logistic point for drug trafficking and illegal flows that go on throughout the Americas.
Years ago, the scourge of drugs was coming out of the Andes, and with efforts made to squelch it through various means, both the trafficking and the production. Even 15, 20 years ago, you could see that the new paths were going to go through the Caribbean and Central America.
As order breaks down in the Northern Triangle, the countries of the region are increasingly at the whim of transnational forces, drug cartels from over the border in Mexico, and violent street gangs like MS-13 and the 18th Street Gang, which have their roots in the United States.
In the 1990s, A lot of gang members who had come from the Northern Triangle were deported back, and they established a system of extortion so strong that the president of Guatemala says that every single business in Guatemala pays extortion. This is not extortion like you don't pay me and I will break your arm or put a brick through your window. This is you don't pay me today, I will kill you tomorrow, or I will kill a family member at the end of the week, or we will send a team to gang rape your daughter.
The Salvadorans came to Los Angeles and then they formed gangs, and now many of them have gone back to El Salvador. They really don't find economic opportunities, and the gangs give them a kind of identity.
People are not safe at home like Honduras and other countries, and they have lost all faith that the situation is going to change.
The violence in the Northern Triangle is born of desperation. Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras are countries with stark economic inequality whose poorest citizens have little hope of advancement.
Many of these societies are controlled by traditional elite groups. They're referred to sometimes as the oligarchs, and they have amassed enormous wealth. They concentrate wealth. They run the main economic activities in these countries, and their commitment is much less to open up these societies and give opportunities to others than it is to just perpetuate and increase their wealth.
The economic situation in Honduras hasn't been a very good one for many reasons. The impact on security issues, stability, and also private businesses have been having a tough time.
As somebody who's been acquainted with Central America for more than 35 years now, I often ask myself, why is it that they have not made more progress?
In 2014, a farmer could earn $2.20 for a pound of raw coffee beans. By 2019, the price had plummeted to a low of 87 cents. Since 2017, even coffee farmers who supply Starbucks and other Western brands have been operating at a loss.
A lot of their economies are heavily reliant on crops like coffee. Coffee prices go up and coffee prices go down, and so they're very vulnerable.
One has to take into account modernization of agriculture, whatever it is happening, is good in many respects, but it also has led to less demand for particularly unqualified, non-skilled labor. And those non-skilled labor have historically moved to the cities. They go to the slums and they feed criminality and so on.
I have friends that have been in the coffee business for a long time, good people, they're hardworking, and I mean, they also provide jobs for other people that grow coffee in the community. And they were telling me that, I mean, it's been difficult, like all these drug cartels, sometimes they take up all these territories. They want land, they want to control everything in a community. And if these coffee growers don't do what they say or they don't sell them their land, then something might happen.
The countries of the Northern Triangle have some of the lowest tax revenues in the Western Hemisphere, a situation that leaves government programs underfunded and ineffective.
The Northern Triangle has some of the countries in the world with the lowest tax yields. In Guatemala, just about 12% of the GDP is comprised of tax revenue. This largely occurs for two reasons. One, there's a high rate of tax evasion because more than 70% of the people who are in the workforce in the Northern Triangle countries are working in the informal sector, which means that their revenue cannot be taxed by the state. But secondly, elites have consistently come out against tax policies that have had a redistributive effect.
Wealthy people don't want to pay taxes because they don't believe that the government provides good services.
There's a greater demand outside the capacity that Honduran taxpayers have.
When wealthy citizens cannot trust the state, they turn to private security firms. In Honduras, There are now 7 private security guards for every police officer.
Elites have preferred, instead of reinvesting in state institutions like the police and the military, have preferred to contract private security to protect their industries.
For over a century, the United States government has presented itself as the champion of order in the Western Hemisphere.
Well, the United States has intervened in many countries around the world, but most of those interventions have occurred in our own backyard, in the Western Hemisphere. This goes back at least to the turn of the 20th century. There have been parallel trends, if you will. We've both had a sort of a big brother approach. We had the Monroe Doctrine, whose purpose it was to keep European powers from intervening in this hemisphere. Starting with Franklin Roosevelt, you see a pretty marked shift in United States policy towards the hemisphere, which was characterized by the phrase, the good neighbor policy.
In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor.
In the latter half of the 20th century, Central America became a Cold War battleground. The United States took sides, sometimes openly and sometimes covertly, in the region's civil wars.
The overriding concern and interest of U.S. policy was to win the Cold War and to prevent the Soviet Union, the big rival, to get a foothold in the region. The view was that countering the Soviet Union trumped everything else.
You have to go back to the Cuban Revolution and the fact that the Soviets established sort of a beachhead there.
In 1954, the U.S. government and the CIA intervened on behalf of the Guatemalan military and the landed elite to overthrow the democratically elected government, set off a 36-year civil war that left 200,000 people dead in Guatemala, and also a tradition of interventionism on part of the United States in what the U.S. government considered to be its backyard. In 1959, when the Cuban Revolution happened, the United States government became obsessed with a policy of containment in the region and actively sought to prevent another Cuba.
The Soviets have made their decision to support the communists. Fidel Castro has made his decision to support the communists. Now we must make our decision.
The legacy of the United States and its involvement in the Cold War, on balance, in my view, is a positive one. I am not a fan of communism, nor is most of the world.
The practical effects of those interventions delivered neither security for the United States nor liberty for the people in those countries. It was truly a loss across the board.
When peace came in the 1990s, Washington became less directly involved in Central America.
Following the Cold War, the United States government took a rhetorical turn and started supporting the fledgling democracies of Central America with significant development assistance plans.
After periods of violent conflict in El Salvador, and particularly in Guatemala, these disputes were settled through negotiations. As far as those civil wars are concerned, they pretty much were over by the beginning of the 1990s.
The United States and Central America said, well, the wars are over. The Soviet Union is gone. These countries will be fine. There was the notion that everything else will follow. And the fact is, that wasn't the case.
Back in 2007, President Bush made a trip in which he stopped in Guatemala and he stopped in Merida, Mexico. In both of those stops, he got a firsthand view of A, the gang violence in Guatemala and in the Northern Triangle, and B, the drug trafficking and drug cartel violence in Mexico.
George W. Bush, like a traditional Republican administration, had a focus on more economic issues. They believed in free trade, promoted immigration, not a high priority to human rights and to governance and rule of law issues, but certainly economic opportunities and the like.
We negotiated in the Bush administration a free trade agreement with all the Central American countries, the CAFTA agreement. They were an effort to better include those countries in our economic orbit.
The Obama administration championed the Alliance for Prosperity, a plan to promote development in the Northern Triangle and strengthen the region's economies. The alliance continues with a mixed record of success.
It grew out of, I think, President Obama's, at the very first summit of the Americas that he went to, only a few months after he took office, he essentially said, I'm done having these debates about the past. I'm here to talk about what we can do for the future. And what he said, importantly, is we will engage the countries of Latin America as equal partners.
We are committed to working together in partnership with each of these countries to find ways in which we can come up with more aggressive action plans to improve security and development and governance in these countries.
The Alliance for Prosperity was born because of the unaccompanied children's crisis that really got out of hand in the summer of 2013.
It's not about what we can do for the region. It's about what we can do with, what we can do together. We all have an obligation to help the most vulnerable and to keep families together.
There were many conversations between the United States and all of our countries, and conversations going on inside Honduras and also with our neighboring countries that were dealing with the same issues. And they came together and they created this plan.
The question is, was it successful? The short answer is obviously not enough. But in my view, and like many others who worked those issues, we believe that it was the right track, and we should have continued in that vein.
It is the policy of this administration to dismantle, decimate, and eradicate MS-13. They extort, they rape, and they rob. They prey on children. They shouldn't be here.
As a candidate and as president, Donald Trump has used harsh rhetoric to highlight the gang problems flowing from the Northern Triangle. His administration hopes to check the spread of violence.
The Democrats won't support securing the border, which we know we have to do. We have a border for a reason. Every country has borders. So we need agents, we need technologies. In some places we need barriers.
The media won't tell you this, but we're building the wall, and we're building it on an expedited basis. We're taking money from all over because, as you know, the Democrats don't want us to build the wall. They're fighting us at every step.
Well, it's a complete misreading of legislative history. Democrats and Republicans worked together in 2013 to do a bipartisan bill. It had security at the border. It had security at point of employment. It used visas to address job shortages in the United States. It had a path to citizenship for folks who had arrived before a particular date. It was a bipartisan, let's solve these problems. What we now have is a president who wants to use immigration as a political tool to exacerbate differences in America.
President Trump has pressured Mexico to join his crackdown on Central American migrants. Experts are watching to see how Mexico adjusts to its role as a transit country.
There's been a huge change in the makeup of the population that's arriving at the US southern border. In the 1990s, it was 80 to 90% Mexican. Now, it's less than 10% Mexican, and then the numbers are much higher from the so-called Northern Triangle group of countries.
The ironic positioning of Mexico in between the Northern Triangle and the United States has been very, very difficult for Mexico. President Trump has threatened to put tariffs on all Mexican imports to the United States. There was an immediate negotiation that followed. And as a result, those Central Americans who come to the United States seeking asylum, fleeing what they consider to be a well-founded fear of persecution, they are waiting in Mexico.
Mexico is a flourishing society, but it's not yet as rich as the United States. And so if we look at the principle or global responsibility, who can afford best to provide the cost of integration? Mexico can afford to take some, but the U.S. can afford to take more.
The limitations that the Trump administration has placed on temporary protected status for migrants from Honduras and El Salvador may have lasting and unpredictable effects within those countries.
The administration's argument is that they don't qualify under the 51 Convention. That is, they are not individual targets of persecution on grounds of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or social group. Put together generalized violence with the climate stress on many farms, and you have a significant number of people who are not fleeing specific individualized persecution on race, nationality, religion, etc., but are having to flee for their lives.
In our experience, we work at the International Rescue Committee from El Salvador through Mexico into the southern parts of the United States. And the reason people move on is in some cases for economic reasons, and in those cases they don't qualify for asylum status in the United States. But for many of them, the gangs that they are fleeing from operate not just within Guatemala or within Honduras, they operate on the refugee transit routes.
We have asylum laws that we know are creating the wrong incentives. We're creating the incentive for poor little children to be kidnapped or brought across the border just so some adult can get to be released. How could you feel good about yourself? You say, oh, I don't want to do any of that, because that's what's happening. And then not giving the border agents enough help to deal with the humanitarian crisis.
The Trump administration wants a safe third country agreement with Guatemala, which would require refugees to first seek asylum there before continuing on to the United States. Critics say the agreement with Guatemala, the single largest source of asylum seekers at America's southern border, is not realistic.
There is also talk of something called a safe third country agreement being negotiated. This is where those countries would accept to process Central American migrants in their country for asylum before they come to the United States. The difficulty with that is that both Mexico and Guatemala, as countries that could potentially receive refugees, are very dangerous places themselves and would not qualify by most international lawyers' definitions as being a safe refuge for people fleeing on foot from El Salvador or from Honduras.
There's an awful lot of pressure on our border from people coming up from the south. That kind of pressure tends to produce the kind of decisions that you've heard that Mr. Trump has made, saying, well, okay, if these people are so afraid for their lives, they should seek asylum in the first country on which they set foot. Well, they've left Guatemala and they've gone into Mexico. Seek asylum there.
The United States is a beacon of hope around the world. We should not say to them, you have to stop short by going to the first country that will take you. No one said to my grandmother and grandfather leaving from Ireland, well, you should just go to England. It's closer than the United States because we should be your last resort. I think the history of America is we welcome people who are fleeing injustice, fleeing from oppression. And if, as part of the bargain, they happen to improve their lives economically as well that's good for America as well. That should be what the United States stands for.
In the long term, the most important looming question is what, if anything, the United States can do to help stabilize a broken region.
I think the most important response that the United States can have in respect to the Northern Triangle countries is to take a long-term commitment to the economic, political, and social development of those countries. Because in the end, it is the stability in those countries that is the root of the exodus that is currently taking place.
The United States has a responsibility to help stabilize these countries. I think we have to think about strategies, perhaps working with Mexico and other countries, and perhaps with the international financial institutions to see what can be done to relaunch these economies. They've got the potential. There's agriculture down there. There's rich agriculture. They can do light manufacturing. They can do certain kinds of services. It just is going to require a little more focused attention.
As Guatemalans, Salvadorans, and Hondurans flee their homelands in ever larger numbers for the danger and uncertainty of migrant life, American policymakers are evaluating their country's checkered legacy in Central America. But What with violence mounting and the economy in tatters, the dream of peace and prosperity in the Northern Triangle, which for decades has proved so difficult to achieve, now seems more distant than ever.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet in community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants
So I think we're ready to reintroduce or to share your screen and have you begin your presentation. A powerful video.
Okay.
So you can go ahead and reintroduce yourself, and if you have any questions about how to share your screen, let us know.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes. Looks good.
All right. So let me. All right. Thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. I really appreciate, and it's really an important topic and very hot, especially at this time of the election. So the title of my talk is the title of the great discussion series is Panic at the Border, U.S. Relations with the Northern Triangle. I'll try to go slow because I have an accent, so for everybody to understand what I'm saying. So here is what I have planned for today. I'm going to show where the Northern Triangle is located. I'm going to talk about the long involvement of the US in Latin America, especially in the Northern Triangle countries. I will show some of the push factors after the re-democratization of these countries. And I will briefly talk about some of the current developments implemented by the Trump administration related to this issue. I will end with a brief account of the effects of the pandemic on these migration flows. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of the issue that we're going to discuss today, let me locate the Northern Triangle here in Central America. Let me also explain what these countries have in common and show some of the numbers of the population of the Northern Triangle living in the United States. So Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador are the three countries that make the Northern Triangle. The term Northern Triangle refers not just to these countries' economic integration, but also their shared challenges. For instance, there is a widespread poverty, violence, and corruption, forcing large numbers of people from these countries, including women and children, to flee these places and become refugees. Just for context, let me show more or less the size of these countries compared with the size of US states. So you can see here, Guatemala is about the size of Tennessee. El Salvador is 10% larger than New Jersey, and Honduras is about 5% smaller than Pennsylvania. So they have a population, an estimated population here, Guatemala of 16.5 million people. El Salvador is the smallest of them all, with 6 million, excuse me, and Honduras with 9.5 million. According to the Pew Research Center, most migrants from the Northern Triangle already living in the United States have lived here for a decade or more. Even though many of these migrants may be considered undocumented, several hundred thousands of them have temporary permission to live in the and to live and work in the United States via TPS, which is the temporary protected status, and DACA, which is the deferred action of childhood arrivals. With this general background information, let's see some of the historic involvement of the United States in that region. So the United States' presence in Central America affairs can be traced back to the US intervention in Panama in 1903, not to mention the US involvement in Mexico, Cuba, Puerto Rico in the 1800s. However, it was not until the Cuban Revolution in 1959 that the US began to aggressively intervene in the region to prevent the spread of communism. Such interventions became more visible as the US began to promote regime change in many of these countries via coup d'etats in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Of course, the US would claim that these regime changes were to the best interests of the United States. They ended up creating instability and political turmoil in the region. Part of the reason was that to change a left-wing regime, mostly democratically elected, the US would replace it with a right-wing authoritarian or military regime. In many cases, the US would provide training and weapons to guarantee a successful operation. So here you have this picture, all the countries that the United States either attempted a coup or actually got involved with their nation's politics and regimes. Others they invaded, others they attempted invasion. The effects of these widespread regimes, regime changes caused hundreds of thousands of deaths of innocent people in the region. But the situation was most dire in the Northern Triangle countries. In Guatemala, for example, a civil war that lasted for 35 years caused the deaths of more than 200,000 people. So here you have, here in the second picture, you can see a truck carrying several caskets with the bones of anonymous people from a rural village that were found, that now the truck was taking them to be buried. The situation in El Salvador wasn't much different. Civil conflicts worsened when the US-backed right-wing military regime established a military dictatorship in the country in 1979. While in power, they fought left-wing guerrilla groups that wanted a socialist revolution, similar to what had happened to Cuba and Nicaragua. The military coup d'etat happened in 1979, but the civil war lasted until 1992, 12 years later, and there were 75,000 people dead during that time. Even though Honduras did not experience civil war within its borders, the country was affected by its neighbors' instability. Honduras also served as a base for US troops to train right-wing militias to fight the Sandinista, or the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, which was a communist or a socialist group. Here you have a picture of Ronald Reagan holding a t-shirt that says, "Stop Communism in Central America." Now, with the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, the Northern Triangle countries went through a re-democratization phase. However, decades of civil wars and violence left the infrastructure and the economies of these countries devastated. And with a culture of impunity, that became a fertile ground for more violence. The United States did not help to reconstruct these countries, and left them at the hands of governments incapable of building strong democratic institutions. Also, all the arms and weapons that used during the time of the wars were left at the hands of criminal organizations and drug traffickers. So you can see here in the first picture, most of the drug produced in South America, especially in Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia, these drugs have the destination the United States. So the United States is the largest consumer of illegal drugs in the world, especially cocaine. And so here you have the largest producer of this type of drug in South America. And so a lot of these drug cartels began to be established in the Northern Triangle region to facilitate the transportation of the drugs from South America to the United States. Before these routes, this transportation was done by airplane to Mexico, but then with Mexico tackling the drug cartels in their countries, so they started to do land transportation. Also here on the right side, you have a picture of MS-13 gang member, and at the same time that the redemocratization was happening in the Northern Triangle countries, you have the United States deporting many of the MS-13 gang members that were established in Los Angeles to protect Salvadoran immigrants, so from other gangs. So you have a gang that was created to protect others, but then later it became a criminal organization. And when they were deported back to El Salvador, they began to have this international connection between the United States, the Northern Triangle countries, and they also had, they started to recruit more members, and they were financed by the gang members staying in the United States. So with all this happening at the same time, you have the members, these gang members, terrorizing families and fighting with other groups to control territory within these countries. So you have a spike in homicide and murder in these countries like no other place on earth. So here you have the graph on the left. It shows the homicide rate per 100,000 people in the Northern Triangle countries from democratization times to our days. And to the one on the right here shows the numbers in 2018 alone. Notice that Honduras had almost an entire decade of increased homicide rates, and El Salvador had a sharp increase in violence until 2015, when it started to drop again. And here I put, just for reference, the homicide rate per 100,000 people in the United States. The Northern Triangle accounted for the highest murder rates in the entire world. Here you have in this graph a sharp increase in the number of apprehensions of unaccompanied minors and their families at the border. And this coincides with the increased violence in the Northern Triangle. According to the Migration Policy Institute, about 2/3 of unaccompanied children and more than 90% of family unit apprehensions were from the Northern Triangle. Now, besides violence, there are other push factors in the region. For instance, the lack of economic opportunities, family reunification, climate change. So, lack of economic opportunities. Northern Triangle countries are among the poorest countries in Latin America. Also, these countries have one of the highest unemployment rates and concentration of wealth among all nations in Latin America. More than half of the population in these countries is below the age of 25, which increases the likelihood of deciding to leave for better living conditions. Also, another push factor is that there is family reunification. 82% of recent migrants already have relatives in the United States, which makes much easier to decide to migrate because they have already the networks and the connections that can help them with adaptation, with finding jobs. And a recent push factor for the Northern Triangle countries, but it's not just restricted to the Northern Triangle region alone, is climate change. In 2015, an estimated 1.5 million people in the Northern Triangle countries faced food insecurity. In July this year, ProPublica and the New York Times Magazine published an article titled, "Where Will Everyone Go?" where they show different possible scenarios affecting migration patterns and possible government responses, which will directly affect how these populations will either stay in their regions or come to the United States. So there is a lot of statistical models that they run to predict some of these possible scenarios, but also that are really tied to how the government will act in the next few years related to this new wave of climate refugees. Considering all these factors pushing people out of their countries, what is the current administration doing to deal with this crisis? First of all, it's essential to say that these waves of migrants/refugees did not begin during this current administration. Apprehensions at the US-Mexico border are at a historic low. However, there has been an increase in the apprehension of families and unaccompanied minors seeking asylum. Due to this increase of families showing up at the border, in 2014, the Obama administration changed its previous policy and began to detain families while they waited for their asylum cases to be processed. But families had to be released after 20 days. Although no one knows necessarily how many children were separated from their families during the Obama administration, these cases were rare and only happened for the child's safety in case there were questions of potential human trafficking, danger to the child, or false claims of parentage. Now, since taking office, the Trump administration has implemented policies on a wide range of immigration issues, from asylum to deportation policies, refugee resettlement, and admissions from certain majority Muslim countries. Many of these policies affect those coming from the Northern Triangle directly. Here are some of these policies. However, the list is much longer and also includes legal immigration. So the Trump administration is not just targeting undocumented or illegal immigration, but also legal immigration. I'm not going over all this here for the sake of time, but I want to direct your attention to two of them. The first one here that I want to direct your attention to is the zero tolerance policy. This policy, also known as family separation policy. So if you hear on the media, they might gonna say family separation policy instead of zero tolerance. This policy became known for the widespread family separation at the US southern border. In April 2018, the US administration decided to separate families from the Northern Triangle countries to deter and to stop the caravans. The children were detained in a separate facility for months and separate from their parents while living in cages in terrible conditions. Now, their parents, when they were separated, they were facing prosecution and deportation. So you had, they were separated for the parents to face deportation proceedings and prosecution. Historically, first-time offenders violating immigration laws would not be criminally charged before deportation. Criminal prosecution and eventually conviction would be reserved for those who committed re-entry after being removed, which is a felony. Many of the parents were deported while their children remain in the United States. And here's a breakdown of the children detained in their countries. So you can see here on the left, you have 416 girls under 10, 525 girls 10 or older, 617 boys under 10, and 1,096 boys 10 and older, from a total of 2,654. Here you have the breakdown by country. So most of them are from Guatemala, but you also have a large group of people from Honduras and El Salvador. Now, I didn't know that Brazil, which is my country of citizenship, was on this list, but there were 43 families separated at the border. Just this morning, this is just while I was coming to Hope College this morning to work, it was all over the news. There are still more than 500 children that have not been reunited to their parents, despite the court order to reunite these families. These children seem to be from a pilot program in 2017. It's not even from this 2018 policy, zero tolerance policy, but it's from a pilot program in 2017, which, due to the passage of time, it made more difficult to find their parents. So you still have that these number of children that are that weren't reunited to their families, which the parents are already in their countries of origins. A second policy that I want to briefly talk about is the Migration Protection Protocols, or MPP, which became known as the Remain in Mexico policy. MPP forces all migrants who entered the United States without documentation, even those trying to apply for asylum legally through a port of entry, they have to go back and stay in Mexico. Some 55,000 asylum seekers have been removed from the United States to these camps, which are really dangerous and deplorable, because in those places, they are facing more violence, kidnappings, ransoms, all sorts of things that they are escaping from the Northern Triangle countries. And here I have some news about the situation with our times, through the pandemic. Here are some developments after the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 has had an impact and presented new challenges on Central American migrants arriving at the southern border. So, for instance, Border Patrol agents now, they're citing a CDC regulation that says that prohibit individuals from entering the country if they pose a danger of bringing disease to the United States. So now, because of the CDC regulation, those who are seeking asylum are being expelled automatically from the border. So this is a violation of international and US refugee laws. And so far, since March 20, when the United States had an agreement with Canada and Mexico to not send flights to these countries, since that time, 147,000 people have been expelled under the CDC justification. Also, due to COVID-19, MPP hearings for asylum seekers sent to Mexico have been suspended indefinitely. So the people that were promised to stay in Mexico for a couple months, now they have been there for almost a year now, and there is no guarantee that they're gonna be heard anytime soon. Their case is gonna be heard anytime soon. Now, a second impact of the COVID-19 on the Northern Triangle countries is that recently a new caravan was formed in Honduras. But when they arrived at the Guatemala's border, they have been blocked by the Guatemalan government. And the reason, so they turned back more than 3,700 potential migrants at that point. And the reason was that they were referring to the health risks related to COVID-19. So that shows how it is actually changing migration patterns and movement of people, because so far until this time, the Guatemalan government and the Mexico government would allow them to walk all the way up to the US border, which is now not happening. Of course, there is a dispute in narratives, some saying that this is because of COVID, others saying this is the pressure of the United States over these governments. So poverty and weak economy are already pushing factors in the Northern Triangle. However, with the pandemic outbreak, these conditions have worsened in these countries. So there are more poverty and less opportunities, job opportunities there. But we are still to see the full effects of this pandemic for these people. Thank you. I'm open for questions.
Great. Okay, I do have one in the chat. It's asking if NAFTA has played a significant role in the adversities experienced by Central American agriculture and the flow of poor Central Americans to cities over the past quarter century.
Well, that's a great question. I would say that NAFTA would be in a way more damaging to the US economy than to these countries' economies. Because of course, companies do take advantage of low-paying jobs in Latin America in general, but also in Asia, in Africa countries. But they are at least offering jobs to the population that has, that have seen jobs just vanish. So I would say that some of these companies, although are very exploitative, the labor relations and are not to be praised at all, but they have not damaged as much as they have made the situation in the United States a problem. And also that is one of the major reasons why Trump became popular among blue collar folks, that was his criticism of these companies being shipped away from the United States to less developed nations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. In addition to that, same person's asking, have U.S. efforts to better include those countries of Latin America in our economic orbit actually improved or damaged the economic sustainability of Central American laborers and small farmers?
Well, I think that the direction the United States was going towards. Like if you see the program from the Obama administration, Alliance for Prosperity, that was mentioned in the video, that is really where you had, the United States investing, but not just investing money, but also committing these countries to have reforms that would be very positive for the population. But while I think from the United States would give $740 million. At the same time, these countries would commit to more than $5 billion for these programs. But with the Trump administration, the program has been almost underfunded. So you have now a situation where you could, instead of keep investing and trying to develop these nations, you now have a situation where you are trying to take the money or suspend the money until they do what you request. So that's more or less the deal that's being done now. U.S. has threatened with tariffs and with not sending the financial help in exchange for securing the border at the southern border of Mexico and the southern border of Guatemala. So yes, economic development would be ideal, and that was the direction that we were heading toward, but not anymore.
Okay, thank you. Another one, you've spoken about US trained right-wing militias that warred against democratically elected Central American governments. Could you add something about the School of the Americas?
I am not sure what is the School of the Americas.
Okay. Tom, I'm gonna open it up to you in a minute, but let me ask another question first. We have another one. Does any government entity in the US make unbiased assessments of how many refugees and asylum seekers the US can absorb annually? Tough one.
I don't know. It's interesting because if you see the numbers of the United States are admitting now, it's so low. I mean, if you look at since Trump took office, it went from 85,000 in 2016 to 54,000 in 2017 to 45,000 in 2018 to 30,000 in 2019. In 2020 is 18,000.
Wow.
And for next year, they are only admitting 15,000. So it is something that is unprecedented. It has never been this way. And that's gonna be, of course, there is a justification for this 15,000 now. It's about COVID. So everything, all the changes that are being made to legal immigration and refugee assessment and processes are made under the justification of the COVID pandemic and how that has impacted the economy in the United States, and how that has, because of that, how that has to be changed and has to be reviewed. So not only the number of H-1B visas are dramatically reduced, also the number of refugee that the United States is taking, it's going to be reduced. But the number of people showing up at the border probably is going to increase, or maybe not. It depends on how, these other borders at the south of the United States will deal with these caravans. But it seems like the United States is reducing all entries. And of course, at the end of the day, what is necessary is an immigration reform to actually see to revise all these numbers and to bring an immigration that is sustainable for the country, but also that has it's seen the future of immigration in the United States.
Mhm. I think related to that, there's a comment / question that says someone thought that sick people were turned back from Ellis Island, and they're asking, is that now illegal?
Well, they're sick. I need to clarify that, if the person can clarify if that is about COVID related disease or it's any kind of sickness.
Okay, I will message her that question. Here's another one. Has the situation made it more feasible for ISIS to gain a foothold in the Northern Triangle countries that have a far-reaching effect on the Americas in the future?
By ISIS, it's related to the Middle Eastern, like the terrorist group. Yeah, I haven't heard of any infiltration of terrorist groups amongst those in the caravans. There is speculation and sometimes just these crazy theories, but there is no necessarily a relationship between what is happening in the Middle East to what is happening, although both have US intervention and problematic US foreign policies. But I'm saying in terms of necessarily people from ISIS flying over to the Northern Triangle to infiltrate the caravans to reach the United States. There is no, I haven't heard anything about it.
Okay. Clarifying question from the NAFTA one before is asking if NAFTA has been disadvantageous to Central American farmers or if it has benefited Central American agriculture.
I can't answer that question.
Okay. Another one, do any migrants from the Northern Triangle go to Costa Rica, which is a more stable country?
Yeah, so Costa Rica is a stable country in terms of the countries in that region, but it's also a poor country. It's a very small country, and they cannot absorb these amount of people that are migrating. Of course, there are some attempts to create a more a shared economy amongst all these countries in Central America, similar to you have in the European Union, so that they could have open borders and have people free mobility. But that's just in talks at this point, but there is not necessarily the infrastructure and the opportunities in Costa Rica that migrants fleeing persecution could find. That, well, they could find a more stable country where not even army they have, stable, less violent, but in terms of economic opportunities, I'm not sure if Costa Rica would be a better place for them. And also considering that many people have already some connections to the United States through previous waves of migration from the Northern Triangle, especially those who are in the TPS status, that can help them to find, and also to the sheer size of the United States, it is not necessarily the ideal choice at this point.
Another question, do you see any hope for improving the gang and violence problems?
Well, I do. I think that there are people, they have, they need to, I think if the country as a whole, if they really create a better and less corrupt system, it's important to say that there are elites that are doing very well in these countries, and they are the ones to blame for a lot of their issues. But at the same time, because of these elites are really not into investing in the country with taxes and other improvements. So you have people relying on drugs, on drug trafficking, and there's so much money so on the drug business. So it is really something that you cannot blame just the United States, who are the largest consumer of drugs, and in South America, that is the largest producer of drugs. So there is the supply and demand problem here, but you have to stop pointing fingers and start dealing with the issue on both ends. And that has a lot to do with the gangs. So if these gangs are to be drained of their power, it has to be with how drug is done. Of course, we're not talking about marijuana, we're talking about cocaine. So it is really something that it has to be worked out between the United States and also with the producers in South America. So I think once that is dealt with, then I think that's going to take a lot of the financial power of these gangs. And of course, that in itself is not just, it's not good enough, because then they're going to need to have money from other sources. So then, of course, that's when you have to rebuild the country and create opportunities, education, and so forth and so on. So you have to deal with all that, but also targeting the children. I think the children are the ones who are suffering the most right now. And these are the ones that have to be educated and have to be given opportunities for them to not leave their countries. I believe that people don't want to leave their countries, but they do for a variety of reasons. But the worst reasons are the ones that we are seeing from the Northern Triangle countries. And if the United States help these countries to rebuild their economies, their infrastructure, their trust, and bring investments, I think that can improve their lives, can improve the lives of the children. If they stop the culture of impunity, if they start prosecuting, if they start arresting these gang members, I think they have a future, a bright future. So it depends of several factors. It's not just the United States, and it's not just these countries alone, but it's really a cooperation amongst all the parties.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question from someone that says the U.S. currently spends less than $1 billion on aid to the Northern Triangle, but probably more than $2 to $3 billion on imprisoning people along our border, much of it on for-profit prisons. Wouldn't it make sense to reallocate those resources?
Totally. It would make a lot of sense. And there's a lot of reasons for the panic, and it's not just about the idea of having, like, as I think I showed a graph that apprehensions are at a historic low, but that is really something that is used to gain political capital and to stir fear in the population, can win elections. So it is really something that the United States, as as a society, has so much to gain from the resilience of some of these refugee kids. Like that they walk for thousands of miles, sometimes unaccompanied, without parents. And there's so much resilience to have these kids coming and learning here and growing and becoming a U.S. citizen. There's so much to learn from them. It's just that I really feel like sometimes the priorities are just not the priorities, but the fear and the prejudice trumps the logic and how to invest and to use the resources the United States have for the good of these people.
Thank you. Related to that, we have someone that's saying that she apologizes if she should have retained this, but is there a level of funding and strategy by the US at the current time to strengthen stability of government, aid health services, and improve government police in these countries?
In those countries?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm not either. Thank you. I think I hit most of the things, but Tom, if you're still here, Tom Ahrensworth, do you want to clarify your NAFTA question for us if you want to unmute?
Yeah, I've heard from other sources sometimes that that NAFTA has damaged, especially small agricultural interests in Central America, so that the profitability of farming has gone down. You mentioned the profitability of coffee growing production, and that has been a major force of driving people to the cities, which has then fueled disorganization, and crime and gangsterism and poverty. Taking people from a relatively sustainable state into one where they're not sustainable. And so I was wondering whether you see NAFTA as being significant in that process, or if that's been misrepresented to me.
Yes, I think you are correct. There is a problem with these economic systems, and I think NAFTA is to blame for some of that. I'm not sure. There is the article that I wanted to point out to about the climate refugees and what's going to happen in the near future with climate change and the destruction of the crops for low income and rural Central Americans. It might have more information about that. The thing is, I haven't looked at this issue through the lens of NAFTA. So it's hard for me to just give an opinion here without necessarily having read more about it. So I apologize for that.
Well, thank you. No, I was just I was just wondering about it as part of the paternal U.S. relationship with Central Americans and what has often turned out to be a user and used relationship rather than a good neighbor relationship.
Correct.
Awesome. Thank you. Is there anyone else that wants to make a comment or ask a question? We have a couple minutes left. Feel free to unmute yourself or wave your arm or something. Oh, it looks like Mike. Go ahead, Mike.
I thought I heard this morning on a program that we are getting a lot of our meat in this country now because of the COVID crisis from Guatemala. And they went on with a clip to show that these growers are pushing people off of their land and out of their villages. Is that anything you know about?
Can you just clarify a bit? People are being expelled from the land?
Yes. That's what the program, that's what the quip said, that these farm growers, they're growing meat, and there's such a demand for it in the US now, and then they added that we don't know where we're getting our meat from because the laws are now do not have to show country of origin. Even big companies like Walmart and other big meat companies are getting their money, their meat from Guatemala, and in turn, the growers there are expanding and pushing people off their lands.
Well, I'm not aware of those, but it's completely possible, especially if that is also related to the situation with, that is a push factor for these people to leave. So there's a lot of displacement happening. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that was also happening in these farms.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? This feels like a huge mountain to climb, all of the issues that we've discussed this afternoon. So I think I really appreciate your time today, Professor Sarawa, and just the enormity of the weight that this has, and that we need to take continuous steps towards solving it. And I appreciate your candor with us today and your knowledge, and then we're just grateful for this time together. This is our first Great Decision series, so thanks for kicking it off for us so bravely in your first semester at Hope College under all of these extenuating circumstances we're all under. I just want to thank you again, and thank you, Susan, for handling the video. Good job. And thank you all for tuning in. Appreciate you being here this afternoon, and we will see you all again soon. Thank you so much.
I promise that I can answer more questions if they're related to Brazil next time.
Okay. Maybe we'll send you a course proposal for a course that's just focused totally on Brazil. That would be awesome.
Yep.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you. I'll hit you up. You might be sorry you said that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, everybody. Stop recording.